The house looked modest from the outside, a weathered porch with chipped paint and flower pots clinging to life in the afternoon sun. Yet, behind those thin walls, lived a woman who had carried burdens heavier than most could bear. Her name was Margaret, and for decades she had worn sacrifice like a second skin. From the moment she brought her daughter into the world, she had made quiet decisions that always placed her child above herself. When other mothers bought new dresses, Margaret patched old ones. When her co-workers went to lunch, she ate bread spread thin with butter. Each dollar had been stretched until it trembled. Every purchase weighed against what her daughter might need tomorrow. There were nights she skipped supper so the girl could have an extra portion. No one noticed. She never announced her hunger. Sacrifice, for Margaret, was not a performance. It was love, stripped of vanity. Her daughter Lila had grown up in the warmth of that devotion. She never knew the feeling of unpaid tuition or empty cupboards. Margaret worked overtime shifts, trading her health for stability, ensuring her daughter always walked into school with shoes that fit and a lunchbox that didn't embarrass her. Lila thrived. She was smart, pretty, confident. Teachers praised her, friends envied her, and Margaret clapped the loudest at every recital, every award ceremony. But as the years passed, a dangerous seed began to sprout. Gratitude faded, replaced by assumption. The more Margaret gave, the more Leela expected. A new phone for graduation, money for weekend outings, help with rent after moving in with her boyfriend. Margaret gave without protest, telling herself this was what mothers did. She swallowed every hesitation, every sting of being taken for granted, and disguised it as joy. The neighbors often said, "You've raised such a confident daughter." Margaret smiled, but deep inside, she knew that confidence sometimes carried sharp edges. Where Margaret's generation had been taught to save, to endure, to be content with little, Lila's generation demanded more. They equated love with material proof. Margaret felt it most during holidays, when Lila's lists of gifts grew longer each year. Still, she complied, because watching her daughter's face light up seemed worth the ache in her back and the thinning of her wallet. Late at night, when the world quieted, Margaret would sit at the kitchen table with a notebook, penciling figures with careful precision. Rent, utilities, groceries, insurance. Each line of numbers like a soldier she had to place strategically so the army of expenses would not defeat her. She circled due dates, scribbled reminders, and reminded herself that as long as she managed carefully, everything would be all right. She was proud of her skill with money. She had survived on so little for so long. Her credit card was her safety net, used rarely and repaid with discipline. To Margaret, it symbolized responsibility, a small shield against life's unpredictable blows. She kept it tucked neatly in her worn purse, always mindful that it was not for indulgence, but for necessity. One rainy evening, after a long day of work, she sat at the same kitchen table, her eyes tired, her shoulders aching. Leela breezed into the room, her perfume filling the air before her words even landed. She was dressed fashionably, her nails polished, her phone clutched like a lifeline. Without preamble, she leaned casually against the counter and asked, "Mom, can I borrow your card? Just for some groceries and things we need." Margaret hesitated. It wasn't the request itself. She had given the girls so much already. It was the way Leela asked, as though the card were less her mother's possession and more a communal resource. Still, Margaret nodded, pulling the card from her purse with weary fingers. She whispered, "Just the essentials, sweetheart." Days passed, and Margaret noticed a small charge on the statement. Then another, and another. A new pair of shoes, dinner at a restaurant, makeup from a luxury store. The numbers climbed, each transaction like a betrayal dressed in the disguise of normalcy. Margaret swallowed her discomfort, telling herself it was temporary, that her daughter would repay her. But the truth revealed itself one weekend afternoon. Margaret was folding laundry when she overheard Leela laughing in the living room with her boyfriend. Her words cut like glass. "Don't worry about the money. Mom's card is basically a family card now. She doesn't mind. What's hers is ours." Margaret froze. The basket slipped from her hands, clean clothes spilling across the floor. Family card. The phrase echoed in her chest, beating against her ribs like a cruel drum. Years of sacrifice, decades of hunger, endless nights of work, all reduced to a credit card her daughter claimed as communal property. Her heart clenched, torn between sorrow and fury. She remembered the years of patching shoes, of turning down dinners, out of eating bread while her daughter feasted. She remembered the ache in her bones after double shifts, the quiet tears shed in the bathroom so no one would see. And now, the child she had bled for laughed about her sacrifices as though they were entitlements. Margaret gathered the spilled laundry with trembling hands, but something had shifted within her. The silence that had defined her sacrifices began to crack. A storm brewed where once there had only been patience. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, but inside her mind, a war raged. Was she a mother or merely a provider? Was love a gift, or had it been mistaken for obligation? Each question tightened her resolve, hardening her heart against the daughter who no longer saw her as a person but as a wallet with a pulse. By morning, Margaret's eyes were sharp with clarity. She placed the credit card back into her purse, but her fingers lingered over it. The plastic felt colder than before, heavier. She knew then that something had to change. The woman who had sacrificed silently for decades was still here, but she would not allow her silence to be mocked anymore. Later that afternoon, as Leela prepared to leave the house, Margaret watched from the doorway. The daughter reached casually for the purse sitting on the table, her fingers slipping with practiced ease toward the familiar card. Margaret saw the sly smile curve her daughter's lips, as if this were nothing more than her right. "Don't worry," Leela whispered to her boyfriend with a smirk. "It's a family card." And with that small, careless theft, the line was crossed. Leela twirled the credit card between her fingers, like a magician about to perform a trick. To her, it was no longer her mother's property, no longer something fragile and precious, guarded through years of sacrifice. It was access. It was freedom. It was, in her own words, a family card. And to her husband, Daniel, it was the best thing that had ever happened since their wedding day. They sat together on the couch, the television flickering in the background, empty takeout boxes scattered across the coffee table. Leela leaned back lazily, card in hand, as Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure your mom's okay with this?" he asked, though his tone lacked true hesitation. It was less moral concern and more a perfunctory question, like a man pretending to test the waters before jumping in. "Of course," Lila replied smoothly, brushing her glossy hair over her shoulder. She said herself, "It's for groceries and things we need, and we do need things. You and I are family. She's family. Family means sharing." Daniel smirked. "Sharing a little is one thing, but this card's a gold mine. Why should we waste our paychecks on bills and boring necessities when she has this?" Leela's lips curled into a satisfied smile. "Exactly. She never says no. Besides, she owes me. She raised me to believe I could have whatever I worked for, and I am working. It's just that sometimes," she tapped the card against her palm, "it's easier to let her cover it. She can afford it." What Lila never considered, what she refused to consider, was how hard Margaret had worked for every cent. To her, the long nights, the skipped meals, the carefully balanced budgets were invisible. All she saw was a card with a limit her mother never used, sitting there as if it begged to be swiped. It began innocently enough. Groceries here, household items there. Lila would stand at the register, swipe with confidence, and tell herself she was saving her own money for more important expenses. But groceries turned into takeout from the trendiest restaurants. Household items turned into scented candles, designer sheets, and a new coffee machine she didn't need. Daniel encouraged it with quiet grins. "She never noticed," he said. "What's a couple hundred? She lives like a hermit. She never used the card enough to realize what's missing." Lila laughed, a laugh that dripped with entitlement. "Besides, I'm her daughter. If she doesn't want me to use it, she should say so. Until then, I'll take it as a yes." Margaret did notice. She always noticed. Her evening ritual of checking the statement was as ingrained as brushing her teeth. At first, she told herself it must be a mistake. $40 at a cafe she'd never visited. $60 at a store she'd never entered. She tried to reason with herself, convincing her heart that her daughter would never take advantage of her like that. But then came the larger charges. $180 at a clothing boutique, $250 at a spa. Margaret's chest tightened as her eyes scanned the page, each number pressing like a thumb against her throat. Still, she said nothing. She rationalized, as she always did. Perhaps Leela needed it. Perhaps Daniel was between paychecks. Perhaps this was just a phase, and confronting her daughter would only cause tension. Mothers, she reminded herself, were meant to be patient. They were meant to give until it hurt. But the hurt was starting to cut deeper. Margaret began to notice the subtle shifts. Lila and Daniel arrived at Sunday dinners dressed a little sharper, their cologne a little stronger, their smiles a little They brought bottles of wine Margaret knew they couldn't afford, talked about nights out at restaurants she'd only seen on television. And when Margaret asked gently how they managed such luxuries, Lila waved a manicured hand and said, "We're managing fine, Mom. Don't worry about us." It was the "don't worry" that broke her heart the most. For decades, worry had been her constant companion. Worry about bills, worry about food, worry about her daughter's future. And now, after giving all she had, she was told not to worry. While the evidence of her sacrifice was being paraded before her eyes, Margaret began to withdraw. At the grocery store, she carried coupons with trembling hands, knowing she couldn't afford certain items because of the unexplained charges on her account. She skipped her weekly treat of tea and biscuits, telling herself it wasn't necessary. At night, she lay awake listening to the sound of rain against the window. The numbers from the statement dancing in her head like ghosts she couldn't exorcise. Meanwhile, Lila grew bolder. What had started as small purchases ballooned into bigger indulgences. A new handbag, matching watches for her and Daniel, shoes that cost more than Margaret spent on an entire month's groceries. Each purchase came with an excuse, each swipe justified under the banner of family. One evening Lila tossed the card onto the coffee table after returning from yet another shopping spree. "You know," she said to Daniel, "Mom should be grateful. At least I'm not one of those kids who disappear and never call. I'm around all the time. I take her to lunch sometimes. She should see this as me staying connected." Daniel chuckled. "Connected to her wallet, maybe?" They both laughed, the sound sharp and callous, echoing against walls that once held only Margaret's quiet endurance. But deep within the modest house, Margaret was no longer laughing. She sat at her table, the statement spread before her like a battlefield. Her hands, once so steady, trembled as she traced each charge. Love was colliding with exploitation, patience with humiliation, and though she had endured so much in silence, a voice inside her was beginning to whisper a dangerous truth. Perhaps silence was no longer enough. She closed the notebook, her lips pressed into a thin line. Tomorrow she would face another day of work, another evening of sacrifice. But tonight, as the shadows gathered around her, she allowed herself a moment of clarity. This was not love. This was theft, dressed in the language of family. And family, she realized bitterly, had come to mean free in her daughter's world. Her heart ached, torn between the instinct to forgive and the need to reclaim her dignity. For now, she remained quiet, but the tension hung heavy in the room, promising that silence could not hold forever. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind of day when the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the kitchen clock filled the silence of Margaret's small house. She was peeling potatoes for supper when the front door swung open and Lila strode in, her heels clicking against the wooden floor as though she owned the place. Daniel followed with bags in his hands, his grin wide, his demeanor smug. They didn't even bother with pleasantries. Lila set her designer purse on the counter, her polished nails tapping impatiently against its leather surface. Margaret noticed the purse immediately, not because of its beauty, but because she knew it cost more than an entire week of groceries. Her chest tightened. She set down the knife and wiped her hands on her apron, steadying her breath before she asked softly, "Where did you get that, Lila?" "Oh, this." Lila's tone was airy, dismissive. "Picked it up on sale. Don't worry about it." Margaret's gaze shifted to Daniel, who smirked but said nothing. His silence was confirmation enough. She turned back to her daughter. "On sale or not, that's not the kind of thing you can afford right now. Please tell me you didn't." Lila cut her off with a laugh, sharp as broken glass. "Mom, relax. It's not a big deal. We used the card. That's what it's there for, right?" The room seemed to tilt. Margaret felt her hands go cold, her heart pounding in her ears. "My card," she whispered. Lila rolled her eyes, exasperated, as though her mother were being deliberately difficult. "Yes, your card. But let's be real, Mom, it's basically a family card now. What's yours is ours. Isn't that what family means?" The words landed like a blade, slicing through decades of sacrifice, devotion, and love. A family card. To Lila, Margaret's years of toil were not sacrifices but obligations. Her love was not cherished but commodified, transformed into plastic to be swiped at will. Margaret staggered back a step, clutching the counter for support. She wanted to scream, to demand how her daughter could be so cruel, but her throat burned with unshed tears. Instead, her mind filled with memories, countless nights of overtime shifts, the smell of bleach clinging to her clothes, the ache in her back from scrubbing floors long after others had gone home. She remembered skipping meals, telling herself she wasn't hungry so her daughter could eat more. She remembered the thrill in Leela's eyes when she received a new dress for prom, how Margaret had pretended not to notice the overdue bills piling on the counter. And now, all of it was dismissed as a family card. Daniel chuckled, breaking the heavy silence. She's right, we're family. Why make such a fuss? It's not like you're using it for much, anyway. Margaret's lips trembled. Not for much, she repeated, her voice breaking. That card is for emergencies. For safety. Not for handbags and dinners. Leela's expression hardened, her face cold and unrecognizable. Mom, stop acting like you're being robbed. You raised me. You promised you'd always take care of me. Well, this is part of it. It's not theft, it's family. And if you really loved me, you wouldn't make me feel guilty for needing a little help. The accusation pierced deeper than any blade. In that instant, Margaret saw with cruel clarity how her love had been twisted, her devotion weaponized. She had poured everything into her daughter, and in return she was told that boundaries equaled betrayal. Her shoulders sagged. She turned away, unable to bear the smugness in her daughter's eyes. She returned to the potatoes, her hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped the knife. The smell of raw starch filled her nose, but she tasted only bitterness. For the rest of the meal, she barely spoke. Lila and Daniel chatted animatedly about their shopping trip, about the wonderful deals they found, about the compliments they received from strangers. Each word was another twist of the knife. Margaret chewed in silence, swallowing her food like stones, her mind spinning. After they left, laughter trailing behind them like smoke, Margaret stood in the empty kitchen, staring at the dirty dishes. Her body felt heavy, her heart hollow. She wiped her hands on the towel, though they were already clean. Slowly, she sank into the chair at the kitchen table, the one where she had balanced budgets and written lists for decades. The betrayal was no longer financial. It was spiritual, emotional, maternal. Her daughter had stripped her of dignity, reducing her to nothing more than a bank account. Margaret wept quietly, tears slipping down her cheeks as memories of Leela's childhood surfaced. The small girl with pigtails who once clutched her hand, who once whispered, "I love you, Mommy," before bed, had become this woman cold, entitled, and cruel. Margaret pressed her palms together, whispering to herself, "Where did I go wrong?" But the kitchen offered no answers. The hours dragged. The clock ticked steadily, each second hammering the truth deeper into her bones. She was not seen as a mother anymore. She was a resource, a convenience. And if she didn't act soon, she would lose not just money but every shred of self-respect she had left. By midnight, the tears had dried. Margaret sat upright, her jaw firm, her eyes sharper than they had been in years. She pulled her old laptop onto the table, the screen flickering to life. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before beginning to type. Words like credit card theft, legal rights, and fraud protection appeared in the search bar. She read slowly, carefully, absorbing each detail. For the first time in years, she felt something other than despair. She felt resolved. Revenge was not about cruelty, it was about reclaiming dignity, about teaching her daughter that love could not be mistaken for weakness. As the night deepened, Margaret made notes on a scrap of paper, her handwriting steadier with each line. She highlighted phone numbers, underlined terms, whispered her plans aloud like prayers. She was tired, but beneath the exhaustion pulsed a new energy. By dawn, she closed the laptop, slid her notes under her notebook, and stared out the window. At the first light of day, her reflection in the glass looked older, harder, but also freer. The betrayal had wounded her, but it had also awakened her. The mother who had sacrificed in silence was gone. In her place stood a woman who would no longer be used. The card lay in her purse, heavy with meaning. Soon, she promised herself, soon they would learn that theft, even under the name of family, still carried consequences. The Saturday market was always busy, but that morning it felt suffocating to Margaret. The aisles were crowded with chattering families and the hum of carts rattling across the tiled floor. She had come only for a few essentials: flour, milk, tea, and hoped to slip in and out quickly. But Lila had insisted on joining her, breezing into the house with Daniel in tow, chattering about how they needed to stock up for the week. Margaret, weary and unwilling to argue, agreed. As soon as they entered the store, the differences were clear. Margaret pushed the cart slowly, carefully checking prices, comparing brands, turning boxes over to read labels. She reached for the generic tea bags, the cheapest rice, the flour that came in plain packaging. For her, every penny mattered. But Lila darted ahead, tossing items into the cart without a glance at the price tag. Imported cheese, sparkling water, organic snacks in glossy bags, luxuries Margaret would never dream of buying. Daniel followed suit, slipping bottles of craft beer onto the pile, grinning at his own indulgence. Leela, Margaret said quietly, picking up one of the boxes. "We don't need this, it's too expensive." Her daughter waved her off, not even pausing to look at her. "Relax, Mom, we're not pinching pennies today. You're with us, remember. It's covered." Margaret's stomach nodded. She knew what covered meant. Her card, once reserved for emergencies, was now a blank check in her daughter's eyes. But in the middle of the crowded store, she bit her tongue. Arguing here would only draw attention, and Margaret had always preferred to keep her dignity wrapped in silence. By the time they reached the checkout line, the cart overflowed. Shoppers behind them muttered impatiently as items spilled onto the conveyor belt: bags of fruit, frozen dinners, specialty meats, and a handbag Leela had snatched from a clearance rack near the entrance. Margaret's small bundle of necessities looked pitiful in comparison, drowned beneath the avalanche of extravagance. The cashier, a young man with tired eyes, began scanning. The total climbed higher and higher, numbers flashing on the screen like cruel taunts. Margaret's heart pounded. Her daughter stood proudly at the front, chatting with Daniel about their evening plans as though the groceries were already paid for. Finally, the cashier announced the amount. It was nearly half of what Margaret earned in a week. Her breath caught. She wanted to say something, to stop the madness before it spiraled further, but Lila was already pulling her card from the purse. With a casual flick of her wrist, she handed it over. "Here," she said loudly, her tone dripping with entitlement. "Put it all on the family card." The words rang through the air, louder than the hum of the store, louder than the beep of the scanner. Margaret froze, her cheeks burning, as the people in line glanced up. The family card. Lila had said it, boldly, as though it were fact, as though Margaret herself had declared it so. The cashier hesitated, glancing between mother and daughter. His expression carried no judgment, only confusion, but it was enough to make Margaret's stomach twist with shame. The murmurs of those waiting grew louder, and she imagined the whispers. Look at her, her own daughter calling her out like that. Must be nice, having your mother's wallet to lean on. Margaret wanted to disappear. Her hands trembled as she clutched the strap of her worn handbag. Her silence felt like complicity, like agreement, but her voice refused to surface. She felt trapped in her own body, her pride dissolving under the weight of her daughter's arrogance. "Family card," Daniel echoed with a chuckle, his arm draped lazily around Leela's shoulders. "That's what family's for, right?" The cashier swiped the card. For a long, agonizing moment, Margaret prayed it would decline, prayed that fate itself would intervene. But the machine beeped approvingly, and the transaction went through. "Have a nice day," the cashier muttered, pushing the bags toward them. Lila beamed, gathering her purchases like a queen collecting tribute. "Thanks, Mom," she said casually, her voice cutting like a blade. "We'll drop some of this off at home later. Don't wait up if we're late tonight." Margaret stood, frozen, watching as her daughter and son-in-law swept past her, bags in hand, laughter echoing down the aisle. She reached for her small sack of tea and flour, the only items she had truly needed, and felt her knees weaken. Behind her, someone whispered. She didn't catch the words, but she felt their sting all the same. Pity, judgment, amusement. It didn't matter which, it was humiliation, raw and unrelenting. As she walked out of the store, the plastic bag handles cutting into her fingers, her vision blurred with tears. Never had she felt so small, so stripped of dignity. Her sacrifices, her endless giving, had led her to this moment, being treated as an afterthought by the very child she had poured her soul into raising. On the ride home, she said nothing. Leela and Daniel filled the car with chatter about their purchases, about the dinner reservations they'd made for the evening, about how lucky they were to live comfortably. Each word was a dagger, each laugh a reminder of her own invisibility. Margaret stared out the window, the passing houses blurring into nothingness. Inside her chest, something burned hotter than shame, anger, not the fleeting anger of a mother, disappointed in her child, but the deep, righteous anger of a woman pushed past her limits. That night, alone in her kitchen, Margaret replayed the scene in her mind again and again, the smug tone, the careless words, the eyes of strangers on her. She clenched her fists until her nails dug into her palms. "No more," she whispered into the empty room. Her voice was steady now, stronger than it had been in years. She opened her notebook, spread the receipts across the table, and began to write. Each number, each date, each charge was another reason, another nail in the coffin of her silence. She would not be humiliated again. The plan was no longer vague, no longer a desperate thought scribbled in the margins of her mind. It was sharpening, taking form, becoming inevitable. And this time, Margaret promised herself, her daughter would learn what family truly meant. That night, the house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that pressed against Margaret's ears, thick and suffocating. She sat at the old oak table, her fingers tracing the grooves worn into its surface by years of meals, homework, and whispered prayers. Before her lay a pile of receipts, evidence of a lifetime of giving twisted into exploitation. Her eyes lingered on one slip of paper, an expensive dinner Daniel had charged to her card. The ink was fresh, but the memory it stirred was old. She thought of all the evenings she had skipped meals so her daughter could eat. There had been nights when she drank only water and pretended she wasn't hungry, smiling as she told Lila she'd already eaten at work. Back then, she thought hunger was temporary. She believed love was enough to sustain her, to nourish her child, to teach her gratitude. But now, staring at that receipt, she realized love alone had not been enough. Her mind drifted backward. Through the corridors of memory, she saw herself as a young mother, hurrying from her job at the textile mill, her hands blistered from long shifts. She remembered picking up Lila from school, kneeling to wipe her face, and pressing a kiss to her forehead. Her own exhaustion never mattered. The joy of seeing her daughter's smile was payment enough. There was the winter she patched her coat, with scraps of fabric so Lila could have a brand new one, the best her wages could buy. Margaret had stood outside the store window for weeks, watching the price, calculating overtime hours in her head. When the day came to finally purchase it, Lila twirled in front of the mirror, beaming. Margaret's heart swelled, even though she returned home shivering in the cold. Then came the school years, each milestone etched into her memory. Parent-teacher conferences where teachers praised Lila's potential. The science fair project Margaret stayed up all night helping with. The prom dress paid for by extra hours cleaning offices after work. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that each sacrifice built a foundation of gratitude, that someday her daughter would look back and understand. But that understanding never came. Instead, Margaret's love became an expectation. Her giving turned invisible, as though it were nothing more than duty. The very sacrifices that had cost her health, her comfort, her peace of mind had become the baseline for Lila's entitlement. Now, as she sat in the dim light of her kitchen, the weight of years pressed down on her. She saw the contrast starkly. The mother who had skipped meals versus the daughter who tossed gourmet cheese into a cart without thought. The woman who worked overtime to pay for education versus the graduate who never once said thank you. Her heart ached, but beneath the ache, something colder stirred. It was not just grief, it was clarity. Margaret thought of her own mother, a woman who had lived by the creed of her mother had said often, family comes first, always. Margaret had carried that torch faithfully, never questioning, never faltering. But as she looked at her daughter, she saw how that creed had twisted in modern hands. Family, for Lila, meant entitlement. Family meant free. Family meant taking without giving. The generational gap gaped wide before her. Margaret had believed in sacrifice. Lila believed in consumption. Margaret had equated love with labor. Lila equated love with access. Somewhere along the line, the thread of gratitude had been severed, leaving only arrogance in its place. She closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks, not from weakness but from mourning. She mourned the daughter she thought she had raised, the values she thought she had instilled. She mourned the years spent denying herself, believing they were investments in a better future. Her hand clenched into a fist, the receipt crumpling in her palm. Enough. The realization was sharp, almost violent in its arrival. Love had not been enough. Love had been devoured, consumed, twisted, until it resembled servitude. She had given until there was nothing left, and still they wanted more. A bitter laugh escaped her lips, startling in the silence. If they saw her only as a bank, then she would do what any bank could do. She would shut down. She would cut off the endless stream of sacrifice. Margaret straightened in her chair, her back aching but her resolve hardening. She began to sort the receipts methodically, placing them into neat piles: groceries, luxuries, unnecessary indulgences. Each stack was proof. Each slip of paper was ammunition. Her pen scratched across a notepad, listing the dates and totals. With every line, her fury transformed into determination. This was not just about money. It was about dignity, about reclaiming the years she had allowed to be taken from her. She thought of the humiliation in the supermarket aisle, the smirks, the whispered judgments. She thought of her daughter's careless words. "It's the family card." Each memory added fuel to the fire burning in her chest. Margaret rose from the table and walked to the mirror in the hallway. She hardly recognized the woman staring back, lines carved deep by years of worry, eyes dulled by fatigue. But beneath that weary exterior was a spark, one that had survived decades of silence. "You are not their servant," she whispered to her reflection. "You are not their wallet." Her voice grew stronger. "You are their mother, and it's time they learned what that truly means." She returned to the kitchen, her hands steady now. The notebook lay open, the plan forming clearer with every passing minute. She would protect what little she had left. She would no longer allow her sacrifices to be twisted into chains. For years, she had believed love was a currency, something to spend freely, without limit. But now she understood the truth. Love, without respect, became invisible. And invisible love was not love at all. The tears on her cheeks dried. The ache in her chest hardened into resolve. She would not beg for gratitude anymore. She would not wait for appreciation that would never come. She would act. Margaret gathered the receipts, closed her notebook, and placed it carefully in the drawer beside her. She took a deep breath, exhaling the last remnants of her hesitation. Love had been her strength, but it had also been her downfall. Now, she would draw strength from something else: justice, dignity, and the fierce will of a woman who refused to be used any longer. And as the night deepened around her, she whispered into the darkness, "If they see me as a bank, then the bank is closed." The kitchen clock ticked in steady rhythm, each sound a reminder that Margaret was no longer hesitating. She had lived too long in hesitation, waiting for gratitude, for respect, for love that never arrived. Tonight, the silence was no longer suffocating, it was empowering. She sat at the table with the phone before her, her hand hovering over it. For a moment, she allowed herself to savor the weight of what she was about to do. Margaret had always been the peacemaker, the giver, the one who sacrificed so others wouldn't have to. But something had cracked inside her, and from that fracture came clarity. Her daughter had mistaken kindness for weakness, love for obligation. The betrayal was deep, but tonight, Margaret was prepared to answer it. Her fingers pressed the buttons with deliberate calm, dialing the bank's number. She didn't rush, she didn't tremble. It was almost ceremonial, this act of quiet defiance. When the automated voice greeted her, sterile and mechanical, she felt a strange satisfaction. Even bureaucracy, in its cold detachment, would now become her ally. The line clicked, and a representative's voice replaced the machine. "Good evening, this is Claire with customer service. How may I assist you today?" Margaret's voice was steady, almost too steady. "I need to report my credit card as stolen." The words hung in the air, sharp and final. She had spoken them without flinching, and in that instant, she felt something shift inside her: power. For the first time in years, she wasn't begging for respect, she was reclaiming it. The representative's tone softened, sliding into professional concern. "I'm sorry to hear that. Can you verify your account details for me?" Margaret answered every question with precision, her voice clear, her breathing calm. Name, address, date of birth, security code. Each answer was like laying down bricks in a wall that would shield her from further humiliation. She had always been meticulous, always careful. Tonight, that diligence was her weapon. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitaker," the representative said. After a pause, "Can you tell me when you last had possession of the card?" Margaret's lips curled into a bitter smile. Possession. That word was almost laughable. "It was taken from me," she said firmly. "It was used without my permission." Her pulse quickened, but she kept her tone calm, measured. She was no longer pleading for recognition or begging for thanks. She was stating facts, reclaiming the narrative that had been stolen alongside her dignity. Claire's voice was steady, efficient. We'll freeze the account immediately to prevent further unauthorized charges. A new card will be issued to you and sent within 5 to 7 business days. Margaret closed her eyes, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Freeze the account. Stop the bleeding. Shut it down. Each phrase was a bomb, a reminder that her sacrifices would no longer be siphoned away into someone else's indulgences. Would you like to review recent transactions to confirm which were unauthorized? Claire asked. Yes, Margaret replied, her tone clipped but composed. The list began: clothing stores, high-end restaurants, beauty salons. Each charge read aloud was like a slap, but Margaret didn't falter. She confirmed what wasn't hers, line by line, until the list was complete. The paper trail of betrayal had been read into record. There was no denying it now. Claire's voice carried a note of sympathy. I understand how difficult this must be. Rest assured, those charges will be investigated and reversed. Margaret straightened, her spine aligning as if the words themselves had given her back her posture. Investigated, reversed, words she had never dared to imagine applied to her life. Too often she had borne the cost of others' comfort without complaint. Now, the system itself was recognizing her pain, taking her side. Thank you, she said softly, but there was steel beneath the softness. The call ended with reassurances and reference numbers, details Margaret wrote carefully in her notebook. When the line finally clicked dead, she sat in silence, staring at the phone. The act was complete. Quiet, bureaucratic, almost mundane and yet monumental. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt lighter, not happy, not joyous, but free. The invisible chains that had bound her, chains of duty, guilt, and exploitation, had loosened with one phone call. Margaret rose, walking slowly through the darkened house. Every creak of the floorboards felt different tonight, as though the walls themselves were acknowledging her shift. She passed the photos lining the hallway. Her daughter as a child, gap-toothed and smiling. The graduation cap, the wedding day. Each image was a snapshot of love once pure, now soured by greed. Her eyes lingered on one picture: Lila at age 10, holding a handmade Mother's Day card scrawled in crayon. Best mom ever. Margaret felt her throat tighten, but she didn't cry. That card had once been a promise. Somewhere along the way, it had been broken. In this stillness, Margaret whispered to herself, no more. Tomorrow would bring consequences. Tomorrow, her daughter would discover the account frozen, the access denied, the endless stream of indulgence severed. Margaret almost pitied her, but pity was a luxury she no longer afforded. She knew what Leela and Daniel were planning. A shopping spree, another day of excess, funded by her sacrifice. They would walk into those stores with bags already imagined, their entitlement unshaken. But when the card was declined, when the system itself refused them, the truth would finally cut through their arrogance. Margaret didn't need to be there to witness it. The beauty of her retaliation was that it required no shouting, no confrontation, just silence, silence that would echo louder than any words. She returned to the kitchen, tucking her notebook into the drawer. The details were logged, the call was made, the path was set. For years, she had given everything without pause. Tonight, she had given nothing but a phone call, and it was the most powerful act of her life. The clock ticked on, steady and calm. Margaret folded her hands on the table and sat quietly, her breathing even. She was no longer waiting for gratitude. She was no longer begging for recognition. She had reclaimed herself in silence. And as the night stretched into dawn, she knew one thing with certainty. When her daughter swiped that card tomorrow, the real lesson would begin. Morning light spilled over the city, gilding glass storefronts and polished marble floors, a stage perfectly set for extravagance. Leela and Daniel arrived at the mall, as if it were their private kingdom. Leela wore oversized sunglasses, though the sky was gray, and Daniel strutted beside her, keys to a lease car jingling like a declaration of wealth. Their hands swung freely, ready to clutch bags upon bags of indulgence. This is what family means, Lila said, her voice dripping with entitlement. Mom wouldn't want us to hold back. Daniel smirked, adjusting his collar. Why should she? After all, she's not using it. Better us than wasting it on groceries. Their laughter echoed against the mall's atrium, oblivious to the irony. They were not earning, not sacrificing, not even asking. They were consuming, as if greed itself were their birthright. They entered the first store, a boutique lined with velvet displays and glass cases. The sales associate greeted them warmly, eyeing Daniel's swagger and Leela's designer handbag, the very one bought on Margaret's dime. Lila ran her fingers across racks of silk blouses and sequined dresses, discarding tags with careless flicks. She didn't ask prices. Why would she? The family card, her mother's lifeline, was in her mind, bottomless. Within minutes, her arms were full. A sequined gown, a leather jacket, heels so high they seemed like weapons. Daniel wasn't left behind. He selected watches, cologne, and tailored shirts, each more ostentatious than the last. They strutted to the register, piling luxury onto the counter like offerings to their own vanity. Swipe, approved. Bags exchanged. Smiles widened. The spree had begun. Store after store, their arrogance ballooned. Designer shoes, electronics, home decor that would never match their modest apartment. Leela's laughter grew louder, ringing through polished halls. She tossed her hair back as Daniel carried the growing mountain of bags. His grin stretched smugly across his face. At one point, Leela twirled in front of a mirror in yet another boutique. Can you believe Mom ever wore the same coat for 10 winters straight? No wonder she looks so tired. Daniel chuckled. That's why we're different. We don't live small. We live smart. Smart? The word hung like a curse, twisting Margaret's sacrifices into foolishness. They never once thought of the nights she worked overtime, the meals she skipped, the coat she patched year after year. In their world, family didn't mean sacrifice, it meant supply. While they reveled in indulgence, Margaret sat quietly at home. The kitchen was still, the clock ticking softly as she folded laundry. Each shirt, each sock, each towel was neatly stacked, a reflection of her quiet dignity. She did not storm malls or demand recognition. She moved through her day with composure, calm, after the storm of last night's decision. She didn't need to watch what would unfold. She had already written the ending. At the mall, the spree reached fever pitch. Their arms ached from carrying bags, so Daniel rented a pushcart to hold the excess. The cart brimmed with glossy boxes and shimmering tissue paper. They paraded it through the mall like a trophy, drawing glances, some envious, some disdainful. Let's make one big purchase to top it all off, Leela said, her eyes gleaming as they passed the luxury jewelry store. Something unforgettable. Daniel grinned. Now you're talking. They entered, greeted by plush carpets and velvet ropes. The air itself smelled expensive. Behind glass cases sparkled diamonds and gold, each piece reflecting their hunger for more. Leela's eyes landed on a necklace white gold, studded with sapphires. She imagined it glistening at dinner parties, drawing compliments, cementing her place above the ordinary. This one, she said, pointing with a manicured finger. The associate, sensing commission, nodded eagerly. A fine choice. That piece is 2,800. Daniel whistled low, though his grin never faltered. Only the best for my wife. The associate retrieved the necklace, laying it delicately on a velvet tray. Leela clasped it around her neck, admiring her reflection in the mirror. Her smile widened. Perfect. At the counter, the necklace was boxed in satin, the final jewel in their crown of arrogance. Lila slid the familiar card from her wallet, tapping it against the terminal with a flourish. Family card, she whispered smugly to Daniel. The terminal beeped, processing. Then, another beep, louder, sharper, declined. Lila blinked, stunned. She tried again, her laugh forced. These machines glitch sometimes. She tapped once more. Processing beep, declined. The associate's polite smile faltered. Daniel's grin stiffened. Leela's cheeks flushed red. The air, once dripping with superiority, now grew thin with humiliation. Do you have another card? The associate asked, voice gentle but edged with pity. Lila's hand trembled as she glanced at Daniel. His smirk was gone, replaced with a tightening jaw. She fumbled in her wallet, pulling out a debit card. It wasn't enough. She knew it. The balance barely covered groceries, let alone sapphires. Daniel muttered under his breath, "What's going on?" Leela forced a laugh that rang hollow. "It's just, Mom must not have transferred enough this month." The words tumbled out, desperate, clinging to their fantasy. But the reality was merciless. The endless stream was gone. Behind them, other customers watched. Whispers began. Stares lingered. The entitlement that once made them strut, now made them squirm. Lila's pride cracked as she shoved the necklace back across the counter. "We'll come back later." Her voice was sharp, defensive, but it couldn't hide the truth. The spree was over. They pushed the cart of bags through the mall, but the victory had soured. Every purchase, once sweet with indulgence, now felt heavy, tainted. Lila's sunglasses hid her eyes, but not her shame. Daniel walked faster, jaw clenched, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. At home, miles away, Margaret folded the last towel and placed it neatly on the stack. She didn't know the details, but she didn't need to. She could almost hear the echo of the declined beeps, could almost picture the panic in her daughter's eyes. For once, the humiliation did not belong to her. The jewelry store was meant to be the crown jewel of Leela's spree, the final flourish in a day dripping with arrogance. Instead, it became her stage of humiliation. The card had already been declined twice, each beep like a whip across her pride. She tried once more, her fingers trembling, but the terminal screeched its verdict again, declined. The associate's polite smile was long gone. Around them, whispers rippled through the air, sharp and merciless. A woman near the display of earrings raised her brows and muttered, living beyond their means. Another customer pulled out a phone, the small red light of the camera glaring like judgment itself. Daniel's voice was low and angry. Try again. I've tried, Lila hissed, her face flushing crimson. It's supposed to work. It's the family card. The associate tilted her head, cautious now. You mentioned this was a family card, ma'am. Could I see some identification to confirm the account holder? The words sliced through Lila's composure. Identification, confirmation. She was not the account holder. She was not the owner. She was a thief cloaked in entitlement, and the truth now hovered, ready to crash down. Before she could stammer an excuse, 2 uniformed security guards entered the store, their presence towering, undeniable. We received an alert about a flagged card, one of them said firmly. May we speak with you? Leela's heart pounded. Flagged? What do you mean, flagged? Reported stolen, the guard replied. The word echoed in her ears, every syllable shattering the illusion she had clung to. Stolen. That was what her mother had called it. Not shared. Not family. Stolen. Daniel stepped forward, puffing his chest. There must be some mistake. This is her mother's card. Family, she said it was fine. The guard's expression didn't soften. Sir, that doesn't change the fact that the account holder reported it stolen. Until proven otherwise, it's flagged for fraud. We'll need you to step aside. Gasps fluttered across the store. Customers craned their necks, some openly filming. Phones were raised like weapons, capturing every detail of Leela's unraveling. Dignity. Her hands shook as she grabbed Daniel's arm. This is ridiculous. My mother, she wouldn't do this. She wouldn't dare. But deep down, beneath her rage, a seed of fear took root. Margaret would dare. Margaret, who had endured silently for years, had finally risen. The guards led them out of the store, their cart of bags rolling behind them like evidence of their greed. Leela's steps were unsteady, her voice growing shrill. Stop looking at us. Stop filming, she snapped, but her words only fueled the attention. Shoppers paused to watch, their expressions a mix of disdain and satisfaction. About time someone stopped them. A man muttered, "Serves them right." As they reached the mall's main concourse, 2 police officers awaited them, summoned by the store's report. Blue uniforms, badges gleaming, authority embodied. One officer stepped forward. Ma'am, sir, we've been notified of a potential fraud case involving this card. We'll need to see your identification. Lila's throat went dry. She fumbled with her wallet, her hands clumsy, as she produced her driver's license. The officer compared it to the name on the card. Margaret Whitaker, not Leela, not Daniel. This card does not belong to you, the officer said plainly. You are not authorized to use it. It's my mother's, Lila cried, her voice breaking, echoing through the concourse. She's my mother. Family means, the officer cut her off. Family or not, this card was reported stolen. Until this is clarified with the account holder, it is fraud. The word hung in the air like a gavel's strike. Fraud. Shoppers gasped audibly now, whispers turning to gleeful murmurs. Daniel's bravado crumbled. His shoulders slumped as if the weight of the crowd's judgment was too heavy. He muttered something about misunderstanding, but the officer's expression remained unmoved. Phones recorded from every angle. Someone laughed, a cruel, delighted sound. Leela's humiliation was no longer private. It was immortalized, destined to spread beyond these walls. She could already imagine the captions. Entitled, "Couple Caught Using Stolen Card." Tears pricked her eyes. but rage burned hotter. Rage at the officers, at the strangers, at Daniel's useless silence and, most of all, at her mother. Margaret had done this. Margaret had painted her daughter as a thief in front of the world. The officers didn't arrest them. There wasn't enough evidence beyond the flagged card, but the humiliation was complete. The necklace was returned, the bags searched, receipts scrutinized. The cart, once a trophy, was reduced to a pile of evidence that reeked of arrogance. Finally, they were released with a warning. "This will be investigated further," one officer said coldly. "You may want to speak with the account holder." The words were a dismissal, but also a sentence. As they exited the mall, Lila yanked off her sunglasses, her face streaked with tears and fury. The crowd parted, whispers trailing them like shadows. She caught sight of a teenager lowering his phone, smirking. "This is going viral," he said to a friend. The humiliation was complete, seared into her skin. By the time they reached the parking lot, Daniel was silent, his jaw locked tight. He shoved the bags into the trunk without a word. Lila slammed the car door, her breaths ragged. "Mom did this," she spat, her voice venomous. "She set us up to be humiliated." Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth was undeniable. Margaret had struck her blow, and it had landed with devastating precision. As they pulled out of the lot, Lila's fists clenched against her lap. "She thinks she's won. She thinks she can embarrass me in public and get away with it." Her voice grew louder, harsher, trembling with rage. "She doesn't understand. No one humiliates me. Not my mother. Not anyone." Her eyes burned. Her lips curled into a snarl. "I'm going home. And when I walk through that door, she'll regret this." The car sped down the road, headlights cutting through the darkening sky. Behind them, the mall stood tall, a monument to their downfall. Ahead, Margaret waited in her quiet kitchen, unaware of the storm about to thunder into her home. The front door slammed with a force that rattled the picture frames. Lila stormed into the house, her heels echoing like gunshots against the hardwood floor. Daniel followed behind, silent but tense, his face tight with anger and embarrassment. Bags from the aborted shopping spree scattered at their feet like evidence of privilege, meeting its reckoning. Margaret rose from the kitchen chair where she had been folding laundry, her hands calm, her posture straight, eyes steady. She had expected this storm. In fact, she had welcomed it, for confrontation was the only way clarity could be achieved. "Mom," Lila's voice cracked, oscillating between fury and disbelief. How dare you report the card stolen? Do you know how humiliating that was? In front of everyone." Margaret's expression remained unreadable, almost serene. She let her daughter's accusations tumble over her like water against stone. Years of verbal slights, entitled demands, and disregard had not hardened her heart toward anger. Instead, they had refined her resolve. "You humiliate yourself, Lila," Margaret said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension like a sharpened blade. "Not me." Lila's cheeks flushed crimson. "Excuse me, I'm the one who stopped," Margaret interrupted, her tone calm but commanding. "No, you will not speak over me. Not now, not ever again." The room was heavy with silence, the kind that presses against your chest and refuses to leave. Lila's chest heaved, a storm ready to erupt, but Margaret's eyes held the storm at bay. "You have mistaken my love for weakness," Margaret continued, each word deliberate. "You have believed that because I provided, I would never enforce, that because I gave freely, I could be exploited. That assumption ends tonight." Daniel shifted, his hands in his pockets, his jaw clenched. Lila's fury seemed to fuel him, but he remained silent. The first time Margaret could remember. "You see, motherhood is not a license," Margaret said, pacing slowly toward them, her presence calm yet commanding. "Motherhood is love, sacrifice, teaching values, instilling respect. It is not a free pass to consume without thought, to take without gratitude, to turn kindness into currency." Lila's mouth opened, closed, and opened again. Words failed her, caught somewhere between indignation and dawning realization. Margaret continued, her voice steady, unwavering. "For years, I have labored silently. I have worked overtime, skipped meals, patched your coats, paid for your education, and ensured your comfort. I have watched your growth with pride, hoped for your gratitude, and offered my love without condition. And what have I received in return? You can't." Lila tried, her voice sharp, but Margaret did not flinch. "In return," Margaret repeated, "I have been treated as a bank, a resource, a convenience. My generosity has been mistaken for weakness, my patience has been met with arrogance, my love has been commodified. That ends now." She paused, letting the words settle. Lila's eyes darted to Daniel, searching for support, but Daniel's face was unreadable, a mask of frustration and fear. The power had shifted, and it was undeniable. Margaret walked closer, her gaze unwavering. "You say you were humiliated. I say you have finally met the consequences of your actions. Every swipe, every indulgence, every act of entitlement today, it has been measured and accounted for. And let me be clear, no apology, no entitlement, no manipulation can undo the truth. You overstepped, and now you must understand that love has boundaries." Lila's fists clenched at her sides, trembling. "Moan, Inu." Margaret's voice rang out, resonant, final, not another word. "You will not lecture me on humiliation. You will not redefine family to suit your greed. You will not mistake my heart for a purse. I am your mother. That is not negotiable, but neither is my dignity." The weight of her words pressed down, an invisible hand forcing acknowledgement. Lila's lips parted, seeking a retort, but the words wouldn't come. Her face flushed, her eyes wide, and for the first time, the arrogance that had fueled her life faltered under the gravity of reality. Margaret's voice softened, but the strength behind it remained unyielding. "From this moment forward, respect is not optional. Gratitude is not a request. Boundaries will be honored, or consequences will follow. The family card is no longer yours. My generosity is no longer infinite. And my love, while still unconditional in heart, is no longer naive in practice." She turned slightly, folding her arms, and looked at both Lila and Daniel with quiet authority. The air seemed to still, every breath measured, every heartbeat a drum of accountability. Lila opened her mouth again, but Margaret's gaze held her in place, speechless. The entitlement that had once radiated from her like armor now faltered, stripped away by the truth she could not deny. She had crossed lines, but her mother had redrawn them with precision and calm, leaving her exposed. Margaret's final words landed softly but firmly. "Blood ties do not excuse theft. Being family does not mean being immune. My love does not give you a right to diminish my life, my efforts, or my dignity. Learn this now, or suffer the consequences later. This is the law of respect, and I am the enforcer." Lila sank onto the nearest chair, trembling, the magnitude of her mother's authority crashing over her like a tidal wave. Daniel's shoulders sagged, resignation seeping in as he finally comprehended the depth of their miscalculation. The house, once a battlefield of whispered complaints and unspoken grievances, felt still. Margaret had reclaimed it, her presence a fortress of moral and emotional strength. For the first time in years, the balance had shifted. The entitled child, flushed with arrogance and expectation, now faced the cold, unwavering reality of consequence, and Margaret, serene yet powerful, had finally reclaimed her dignity. Lila's lips parted once more, but no words emerged. Speechless, she sat in the quiet, finally forced to see what had always been before her eyes. Love does not authorize theft, and respect is not optional. Margaret returned to the kitchen, her composure unbroken, her heart steady. She had spoken, and the lesson had landed with undeniable force. The room seemed lighter, the weight of years of taken-for-granted sacrifices finally acknowledged, if silently, by the very daughter who had tried to exploit them. The confrontation was over, and, for the first time, Margaret could breathe freely in her own home. The morning sunlight spilled gently through the kitchen window, painting the room in soft gold. Margaret sat at the table, a porcelain cup of tea cradled in her hands. Steam curled lazily into the air, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to simply breathe. The house was quiet, no frantic swipes of credit cards, no hurried footsteps of entitlement, no whispers of greed, just stillness and the comforting rhythm of her own presence. The events of the past day played in her mind like a vivid tapestry. The mall, the humiliation, the confrontation, each memory carried a weight, but now it rested lightly, as though gravity itself had shifted. Margaret had given up the notion of control long ago, had surrendered 2 years of unacknowledged sacrifice, but yesterday had proven that boundaries, when enforced, were stronger than any amount of blind devotion. She lifted the cup, taking up a small sip of tea, savoring the bitter warmth that reminded her life was hers to live. The house smelled faintly of freshly brewed coffee, of laundry recently folded, of normalcy, things she had once taken for granted but now cherished like rare treasures. Her mind wandered to Leela, pacing somewhere in the back of her thoughts, simmering in silence, her arrogance tempered by consequence. It was poetic, Margaret thought, that the lesson had landed without cruelty, only truth. The quiet was a balm to her spirit. She remembered the years of giving that had gone unnoticed, working overtime while her daughter slept, patching coats, paying tuition, skipping meals, enduring sleepless nights. Each act had been a testament to love, a belief that selflessness could shape character. But love without boundaries had been mistaken for permission. Yesterday had changed that. Love had been taught its limits, respect demanded its place, and dignity reclaimed its throne. Margaret's gaze fell on the empty seat across the table. She imagined Lila there, subdued, unable to find words that could undo what had been set in motion. The once entitled child, so certain of her place in the world, now faced a reality she had never anticipated. It was not malice that Margaret felt toward her daughter. There was no vengeful spark in her heart. There was only relief, and a quiet, profound satisfaction that the scales had been balanced. The tea warmed her hands, spreading calm through her veins. She leaned back, allowing herself to savor the simple pleasure of peace. In that moment, Margaret realized the true nature of victory. It was not found in public humiliation, not in retaliation, and not even in seeing her daughter falter. Victory was found in reclaiming oneself, in standing firm, without fear, in enforcing boundaries without regret. Her thoughts wandered to the future. Lila would adapt, eventually, forced by circumstance to recognize the limits of entitlement. Daniel would follow, his pride subdued by necessity, and Margaret would continue to live her life on her own terms, guided by dignity, tempered by compassion, and fortified by lessons finally learned. The house hummed softly around her, each creak of the floorboards and whisper of wind through the windows a quiet affirmation that the world had shifted. Margaret had transformed the house from a battleground into a sanctuary. Every corner, every photograph, every carefully stacked book reflected her control over her space, her life, and her spirit. She could finally inhabit her own narrative, no longer a passive character in someone else's story of entitlement. She sipped her tea again, letting the warmth fill her chest. In the deep silence, she felt gratitude, not for Leela's submission, not for recognition, not even for material restitution, but for herself, for the resilience that had carried her through decades of giving, for the courage that had surfaced when she needed it most, and for the clarity that had allowed her to act with precision and morality. Margaret allowed herself a small smile, the first unguarded one in a long time. It wasn't triumphant in the way the world defines victory. It wasn't loud or boastful. It was quiet, steady, and infinitely satisfying. She had done what she needed to do, without hatred, without vengeance, only with justice, guided by love and self-respect. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the private lessons taught within the walls of this modest home. The mall, the chaos, the public spectacle, all were echoes now, distant and powerless. Margaret could almost hear the murmurs of shoppers, the clicks of phones, the faint hum of gossip in the air, but it no longer touched her. She had stepped beyond it, into a realm of calm authority. She set her cup down gently on the saucer, and allowed herself to linger in the moment. The sun streamed in brighter now, casting her shadow long across the polished floor, a silhouette of strength. The silence was no longer empty, it was full, rich with possibility. She could move forward without fear, without compromise, and without the invisible chains of past exploitation. Margaret's eyes wandered toward the hallway where Leela would soon be, her daughter's silence a mirror of yesterday's reckoning. For once, Margaret felt no need to intervene, no need to lecture, no need to explain further. The consequences were clear, the lesson indelible, and the dignity she had reclaimed absolute. As she lifted her cup for another sip, she thought not of retribution, but of freedom. She had given all she could, set firm boundaries, and acted when necessary. The rest, her daughter's reflection, her husband's realization, the quiet judgment of the world, was beyond her control, and that was precisely the point. Freedom lay not in dominating others, but in commanding oneself. Margaret's smile widened subtly, serene and confident. The house was hers again, not through confrontation alone, but through moral clarity, strength of heart, and unshakable resolve. She could hear the soft tick of the clock, each second a gentle reminder that time was now hers to cherish. the tea, cooled steam fading into the morning light. Margaret took one last slow sip, setting the cup down with deliberate care. She rose, walked to the window, and gazed out at the quiet street below. Life moved on, as it always does, but within these walls, peace had been restored. Justice had been poetic, consequences real, and dignity triumphant. Margaret had endured, acted, and finally rested. The smile on her face reflected not vengeance, but liberation, calm, firm, and eternal. Behind her, the house held the echoes of lessons learned and boundaries enforced. In the background, her daughter's silence spoke volumes, a quiet acknowledgement of the truth Margaret had imposed without hatred. The scene lingered like a photograph. Margaret, serene and unshaken, framed by morning light, a life reclaimed, a dignity restored, a mother finally free in her own home.